Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. I warmly welcome you to today's webinar entitled Nonviolence and Peace, the Reality of Jesus Today. My name is Emily VanBerkum, and I'm delighted to be your host. I am a theologian and a registered social worker, as well as associate editor of the With One Accord Journal and a founding member of the Magdala Conciliary in Toronto, Canada, both exploring the church's feminine dimension and feminine wisdom in the Catholic tradition. And I am joined by my co-host, Gregory Rupik.
Well, I have to introduce myself. Hi, everybody. My name is Greg Rupik. I have a PhD in the history and philosophy of science, and I'm a contributing editor with One Accord. And I'm also one of the founding members of the Magdala Conciliary here in Toronto.
Today, we have the honor of welcoming Father John Deere from Morro Bay, California, and Loreto Sister Teresia Wachira from Nairobi, Kenya. Father John and Sister Teresia are people of faith, but they are also two world-leading, knowledgeable sources and advocates for nonviolence and peace. So we are thrilled to have you here today. I would like to introduce our first presenter, Father John Deere. Father John is a Catholic priest and internationally known activist, lecturer, and author, extensively published on the topic of peace and nonviolence. Nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, he calls all people to practice the gospel of nonviolence through global grassroots movements for the abolition of war, racism, poverty, nuclear weapons, and environmental destruction. Father John holds 2 master's degrees in theology from the Graduate Theological Union in California and has taught at Fordham University. His 35 books include The Beatitudes of Peace, They Will Inherit the Earth, Living Peace, The Nonviolent Life, Jesus the Rebel, Seeds of Nonviolence, and Walking the Way, Thomas Merton Peacemaker, to name only a few. His autobiography, A Persistent Peace, has been translated into 10 languages, and his most recent book is entitled The Gospel of Peace, Commentary on Matthew, Mark, and Luke from the perspective of nonviolence. As a peace activist, Father John has been arrested and imprisoned over 80 times. He is also the founder of Beatitudes Center for the Nonviolent Jesus and offers regular webinars and podcasts as part of his ministry. That's quite the bio. I think we only scratched the surface. Welcome, Father John. We're so happy to have you here. The virtual floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Emily and Greg, and thank you all for welcoming me here. I thank Lucinda and John and the Magdala webinar and With One Accord and my friend Sister Teresia. I'm not sure where she's coming to us from live, but glad to see her and all of you. And thank you for all you do for peace. You know, the world has gone insane with systemic violence. It's like we're living in a zombie movie, the whole world addicted to war and death and killing. And so the word peace to me has kind of lost its meaning, as has the word love. And that's why Gandhi, 100 years ago in South Africa, started to use that clumsy word from Hinduism and Jainism, ahimsa, nonviolence. And that's all he talked about, morning, noon, and night. And then Martin Luther King did the same thing. That's all he talked about, morning, noon, and night. And that's what I propose we talk about with Sister Teresia for the rest of our lives, that we help each other become people of nonviolence, a church of nonviolence, a whole new world of nonviolence, and then to understand that Jesus practiced total nonviolence. And Gandhi said outrageous things. God is nonviolence. The kingdom of God is total nonviolence. So that's where I'm coming from. But what does it all mean? You know, Gandhi said it's way more than doing no harm in thought, word, or deed. It's active truth, active love that pursues the truth of our common unity, that we're all one. Every human being on the planet is your sister and brother. That's the bottom line. And the deeper you go into the truth of reality, that we're already united, that we're already reconciled, that we're all equal, that we're all children of God, the more you realize you can never hurt anyone, much less kill anyone, much less be silent in the face of all these horrible wars going on in the world and all the other violence, from racism and poverty to the planned destruction of the planet through nuclear weapons and environmental destruction, the use of fossil fuels, and catastrophic climate change. So the deeper you go, the deeper it goes, and you find out you're one with all the creatures and Mother Earth and God. It's just so beautiful. But there is a bottom line with this clumsy word nonviolence, and this is where everybody balks. And this is where we can all get away with this, with word peace. But nonviolence, you can't. The bottom line is that there is no cause, however noble, no matter what anybody tells us, again, for the rest of our lives, for which you and I will ever support the taking of a single human life. We don't kill people. We don't kill people who kill people to show that you shouldn't kill people. We give our lives to stop the killing. We work for the end of the culture of killing, the world of killing, so that it becomes the fullness of life for everybody. And I've spent every day of my life for the last over 40 years saying that, which means every day of my life somebody has said to me, no, you got to kill somebody. This is beginning with Christians. We got to kill Hitler or Mussolini or Saddam. Well, I mean, you could just go down your list of who the people you want to kill. And we were not going, no. So that's like the alcoholic who's addicted to drinking, and you just say, no, you can't drink. We don't kill. We don't do violence. And that's the boundary. Those are the boundaries for which we can begin to become human beings, to begin to practice love, compassion, and discover what peace might be. We know very little about peace. Well, I've been trying to grapple with this forever. And so I wrote this book called The Nonviolent Life. So here, if you're hanging in here with me, I proposed 3 attributes of the life of nonviolence and peace. And the catch is you have to do all 3. But we only want to do 1, maybe 2 at most. So here goes, if you're with me. Got to do all 3 of these. Number 1. You got to be totally nonviolent to yourself from now on. Now, I think we're all wounded people of violence, and we're experts on violence, and we're violent to ourselves to varying degrees. But you and I are going to try to start to non-cooperate with our inner violence. We're not going to beat ourselves up. We're not going to cultivate violence and hate, and therefore resentment and anger. Instead, this is why we pray and why we need God. We go to God and we let go of all of our hate, anger, self-hatred, inner violence, you name it, resentments, bitterness. We forgive everyone who ever hurt us, and we let the God of peace give us the gift of peace. The risen Jesus give us his gift of peace. So we're constantly in our meditation allowing the God of peace to disarm our hearts of the violence within us so that we're part of God's peace movement. We become people like Gandhi and Dorothy Day and Dr. King and Mother Teresa, people of universal love and peace. People of active, creative nonviolence. Okay, while we're doing that, we're letting God disarm our hearts. At the same time, number 2, you practice meticulous interpersonal nonviolence toward every human being on the planet for the rest of your life. And not only that, nonviolence to all the creatures and nonviolence to Mother Earth. And you're going, yeah, well, good luck with that. And you'll go, well, I'm pretty peaceful. I like peace. Yeah, but I'm talking about Who is that one or two or third person deep down that you'd really like to get back at with a little revenge? Those are your teachers of nonviolence. They are your teachers. They're the ones who show you how violent you are. And you get to practice nonviolence with them and learn to love them. And this is where we begin to enter into the nonviolence of Jesus. So how do you be nonviolent with others? Well, you have to train yourselves. You have to study Gandhi and King and all the great new books and methodologies of nonviolence, where you use creative love instead of violence or retaliation. You allow the Holy Spirit of love to intercede and work through you, where you don't fight back, but you don't run away. You engage a person as a human being, even to the point of accepting suffering in the pursuit of justice and our common humanity with love, until the scales fall from the eyes of your opponent and from yourself, and together you can be reconciled, things like that. And with the creatures, and trying to be nonviolent to Mother Earth. Now, at the same time, you're practicing nonviolence to yourself, all people, and all creatures. Third, you have to join the global grassroots of nonviolence. You have to be part of the movement to change the world. And this is the key to the whole thing. I mean, a lot of people about peace are just working on peace for themselves. That's not peacemaking. That's not nonviolence. Because if you are not involved in the grassroots struggle, as Archbishop Tutu said, you're part of the problem. Your silence is complicity with systemic violence. On the flip side, if you're a full-time activist like me, and you're not working on your inner nonviolence and your nonviolence in relationships, you're part of the problem, and that's not peacemaking either. Because then you're just an angry, strident activist, and you're just spreading violence in a weird way for good. And that's not it. No, that's why I'm saying you have to do all three: nonviolence to yourself, nonviolence to all people and creation, and to have one foot in the global grassroots movement. Now, what do I mean by that? The way change happens from Jesus to Martin Luther King is through bottom-up people power grassroots movements. And you see that in Gandhi getting the British Empire to leave nonviolently, and Dr. King, the civil rights movement, bringing down segregation in the United States nonviolently, or there's hundreds of great new movements happening in the last 50 years, especially Lima Gaboe in Liberia. She's brilliant. She won the Nobel Peace Prize. We could go on and on of that. You and I don't have to do everything, but everybody has to do something. We all have to contribute for justice, disarmament, and creation, so that together we can be part of this grassroots movement that can become contagious. And Dr. King defined nonviolence as power. Now, I'm talking about all this because of Jesus. So I'm going to switch for a minute just about Jesus. Gandhi said Jesus was the greatest person of nonviolence in the history of the world. To me, that's just so spectacular. And that's good news. And then poor Gandhi went on to say that the only people who don't know that Jesus is nonviolent are Christians. I go further and say that Christians are the problem, because we're refusing to follow Jesus. We clearly rejected his nonviolence in the year 300. And for 1700 years, we have something called the just war theory. It's nothing to do with Jesus. If Gandhi's right, then every Christian needs to start studying and practicing the nonviolence of Jesus, put down our swords and our guns and our weapons, and work for peace. So a few thoughts about Jesus. I think everything Jesus taught was total nonviolence. And it's all there in the Sermon on the Mount, from love your neighbor and love one another, to show compassion to everyone, seek justice for the poor, and forgive everyone. But he goes farther in the Beatitudes leading up to the key Beatitude: blessed are the peacemakers. They are the sons and daughters of God. This is our core identity. The culture of war says, blessed are the war makers. They are the sons and daughters of what? The United States, the empire, the culture of war. The Berrigans used to say sons and daughters of death. You and I don't want to be that. We want to be sons and daughters of the God of peace. And then Jesus goes and says, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And that was part of the law. But I say to you, offer no violent resistance to one who does evil. That's the commandment right there. And Gandhi read the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5 of Matthew, every morning and every evening for 40 years, including that sentence. Offer no violent resistance to one who does evil. So you have to use creative love to figure out how to be nonviolent. That's what Jesus was doing over and over again. And then Jesus goes farther and says, you've heard it said, love your countrymen, and it is men, and hate your enemies, the people your country is targeting for death. But I say to you, love your enemies. Agape, unconditional, nonviolent love for the people of your nation state that are being killed by your nation state. And then pray for all the people in your country who are going to persecute you for doing that. And then you're really sons and daughters of the God of peace, who lets the sun shine on the good and the bad and the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. This is spectacular teachings. Now, if you follow the Gospels, you see Jesus is a movement organizer like Gandhi and King. And I've just written this big mammoth commentary. I don't know if you can see it. It's called The Gospel of Peace, a commentary on Matthew, Mark, and Luke from the perspective of nonviolence. It's my life's work. And I'm convinced that everything Jesus said and did was totally nonviolent. And one of the key passages for me is Luke 10, where he organizes 72 followers in pairs and sends them out ahead of him, just like Gandhi and King in classic grassroots movement organizing to change the world. And he says, I'm sending you out as lambs into the midst of wolves. That's us. We're lambs going out into the culture of wolves, and we're going to be eaten alive. And now we get to be nonviolent like Jesus. Isn't that fantastic? Isn't that exciting? What's not to like? We're going to follow Jesus, and we heal all the victims of violence. We expel all the demons of nationalism and militarism and racism and war, and we proclaim the reign of God on earth, God's reign of peace on earth. Gandhi said the kingdom of God is nonviolent. So what we're talking about is, for the rest of our lives, you and I are calling for the abolition of war itself, and racism and poverty and guns and torture and nuclear weapons and environmental destruction and greed and everything that dehumanizes the human family, and for a whole new culture of justice, disarmament, and peace. And when Jesus he goes on this campaign to Jerusalem, he gets to Jerusalem, he breaks down sobbing, saying, if only they had known the things that make for peace. And then he walks into the temple where the religious leaders are working with the empire to steal all the money of the poor, and he turns over the tables of injustice in nonviolent civil disobedience. He's not passive. This Jesus is daring, active, and public, but he's totally nonviolent. He says, no more injustice. This is a house of prayer. As the soldiers come to arrest him, his followers are going, oh my God, we got to protect our guy. And they go to take the sword to kill, to protect Jesus, using violence. And he says, put down the sword. Dear friends, those are the last words of Jesus to the church. It's the first time they understood how serious he is about total nonviolence. So they all run away. And Jesus goes to his death in total nonviolence. And he comes back doing civil disobedience, rising from the dead. He's as peaceful and kind and loving and nonviolent as ever, and says, now you go and follow me and carry on my campaign of total nonviolence to the whole world. That's my hope and prayer for each one of us listening today, that we can practice nonviolence toward ourselves and all those we ever meet, and do our part to spread the coming of a whole new world of total nonviolence. Thanks for listening to me.
Thank you, John. Very inspiring, challenging words that I really look forward to discussing with you a little bit later, having a chance to chat with you and Teresia. At this point, I'd like to introduce Sister Teresia. Sister Teresia Wachira attained a doctorate in peace studies from the University of Bradford in England, and has a master's degree in applied theology, peace and justice studies from England's Middlesex University. She has been a teacher and principal in Loreto schools in Kenya, specialized in training young women for peacemaking and reconciliation work. She's a senior lecturer in the program, leader of the Peace and Conflict Studies at St. Paul University in Nairobi, and is co-president of Pax Christi International. An ardent and committed peace scholar and peace builder, she advocates for active nonviolence as spirituality, a way of life, and an effective method of the prevention of violence at all levels. And without any further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Teresia.
Thank you, Gregory, for that introduction. And I would like to thank Lucinda and John and you, Emily, as well, for preparing this special webinar. I would also like to thank all those who are present, and John for giving us that profound sharing on who Jesus is. And it kind of gives me the background to what I'm going to talk about. And I would like to share a PowerPoint, so you will not be seeing me for a few minutes, but then I'll come back. So we were looking at the nonviolence and peace, the reality of Jesus. So first of all, I would like to start with that picture that you see there, which shows our common and caring home that John has been talking about, the environment that is our home. And we all belong to it, giving us the notion, the idea that we are a family. Now, before we can talk about the reality of Jesus, we also need to talk about our own reality. Because if we are going to respond to that world that John has just been talking about, the world that calls us to non-violent living, then we need to understand that world. So our world is divided into two. We have the signs of life and hope. As we can see, I've just mentioned a few there. There are many, but I would like to highlight on what you are seeing on the screen, that our world is beautiful, it's caring, and it's embracing. Therefore, our world is non-violent. It has young people who are vibrant, adventurous, and full of potential. And also it has women and men who are oases of wisdom because they have lived this life. But on the opposite side, we have a world crying for healing because of its brokenness. Young people and old people are broken. There's a culture of greed, consumerism, and violence in all its forms. That is direct violence, as we can see right now in Israel, Palestine, as we can see in Russia and Ukraine, in DRC, Congo in Africa, South Sudan, Sudan, Myanmar, and many other parts of the world. In our own context, we have structural and cultural violence, where we have, for example, a lot of people in Africa, especially the women, are suffering from what we call genital mutilation, which is a violence to women, and many other forms. Then we have the widespread migration of persons, and some are internally displaced. Abandoned elderly people. In my context in Africa, elderly people were taken care of at home. But today we are seeing a shift where the elderly people are being abandoned or taken to homes where some of them are even abused there. A bleeding environment due to climate change. So that is the world we are looking at. And therefore, we have to respond. Then we need to understand that world so that we can respond appropriately. So what is Jesus' nonviolent response to his own reality? Because we need to understand how does Jesus respond so that we who are called to be like Jesus, like Christ, can respond. And John has given us the background to that. So how do we respond to this nonviolent Jesus? And I would like to look at Matthew 14:15-21, where Jesus is feeding 5,000 people. And don't worry, there's that section which says excluding women and children. That's already a violent statement. So what does Jesus do when the people come? It's getting late, and the apostles tell Jesus, you know, it's getting late, let these people go. But what does Jesus say? Jesus, when he sees the crowds, his heart is moved with compassion. And so instead of sending them away, he asks his disciples to feed them. But their first reaction is a violent reaction. No, send them away. We do not have anything to give them. However, Jesus still insists and tells them to go to the people, to feed the people. And so when they go to the people, they are able to get something, 5 loaves, we are told, and 2 fish. And they bring to Jesus, he prays over that, and it multiplies. Now that is very significant, as we shall see later. So then, if we have been called to nonviolent living, then how do we do this? I want just to check if I've jumped a slide, because yes. So we are being called, therefore, to have a paradigm shift. We see that Jesus saw something happened to his heart, the reflection, and then he acts. The see, the judging and acting concept that we have in the world today, that we are called to look at something, we judge, and then we act. So how do we live this nonviolent way? First of all, we have to live it and model it. And the way to do that is to live the just peace values. And John has actually explained them. That is living in harmony, being compassionate, being merciful, being just, being peaceful, loving all, even those we consider to be our enemies. It is about being and doing. So it calls us to a spirituality of sharing who we are, sharing our wealth, sharing our wisdom, and even sharing what we have. Because that is what we refer to as nonviolent living. I would like to share my own experience from my own childhood. We were taught how to be nonviolent through stories like fables about animals. Animals that were greedy were punished. Those that shared were rewarded. So I learned the value of sharing. When our parents were serving us food, we were served equally, and we had to wait until everybody got their food before we could eat. And sometimes you are looking at the plate which had most food, and you would want to take that, but you are told, no, take the one that is nearest you. So we learned how to share, how to love, and how to care. And that saying that you are seeing on the screen was from my late mother. She said that before you open the gate to anyone coming to your home, you must first open your heart. So, and remember, when you open a gate, you are not opening only to your friends. Here she was talking about anybody. Whoever comes to that gate, whether you know them or not, first open your heart. Now, I'd like to share, because of time, I know we are given 15 minutes, there's a lot to share. I want to share also about how others that I am interacting with on a daily basis or weekly basis or monthly basis are experiencing nonviolent living. First of all, I want to start with myself. I'm a religious sister. So my first response is through the vowed life, my vow of chastity, obedience, and poverty. What does that mean? It's calling me to go beyond myself, because of course, I would love to love a particular person and possess. And remember, possession, when we possess and we don't want to give, that is a non-violent move. Obedience, that like Jesus, you go to the cross for the love of others. And poverty, that I'm ready to share what I have. The little I have, I'm ready to share willingly. That I just step where I should be stepping, not having a big foot that I suffocate other people. Then in my daily work, we are training Catholic sisters in active nonviolence. And those sisters are then going out there to train young people. You can see a picture there of a sister. That is Sister Angeli. She's training some militia group in the DRC Congo. So she went to the bush to meet the rebels, to train them in active nonviolence. She was actually risking her life at that time because there was war, but she went, and you can see her there. So that's what the training has done for her and many others. We are also engaged in meeting that other person we think as an enemy, the Muslim community. So we are meeting them and having dialogue, because there is a lot of profiling of the Muslim young people. So we have made a choice to meet these young men and women and have dialogue as one body. The other way is we are being challenged to address any violence in all its forms. And I think John has expressed that very well. I don't want to belabor that we have to start addressing the violence in our own selves, in our communities, and in the global world. And how we do this, I put that on the right-hand side. We have to model nonviolent living. We have to lobby and advocate. Then we also have to be reflective people through prayer and fasting. And here in Kenya, we have what we call the small Christian communities. Communities meet and share, and then also come together when there is need to help the people. So we don't have to say that I'm too old, for instance, or I'm too sick to advocate or to lobby for nonviolent living. I can do it even in my own home. In the comfort of my home, I can pray. I can share. So it's all, everybody is being invited, as we have also heard John say there. I want to share this particular slide. The woman you see on the left, she's demonstrating a peace belt. And this is a non-violent way of dealing with violence in the North Rift, Kenya. The communities there fight, their men fight for cattle. But the women, to stop the fight, they wear that belt. When the woman is wearing that belt, she's giving permission for the people to fight, for the men to fight. But when she takes it out and puts it on the ground, no man can fight. So that belt is used to stop fighting. It is a non-violent symbol. And these women have many other ways. They use their own body to actually intervene against violence. So what we are saying is it is possible to live non-violent in a non-violent way and to encourage others to live in non-violent ways. And in conclusion, I have a statement there. And when John was talking, I felt, that captured what I wanted to share, that non-violent living starts from the heart. we have to have a paradigm shift that violence has never brought peace and it will never bring peace. That theory that John was talking about, the just war theory, has no place in our world today. And therefore, if we have to live non-violently, then we have to teach our hearts to love, to speak, and to act non-violently. So it's a shift, a complete shift. We have to do it ourselves. We have to teach others. And we, as I said, in conclusion, we have to do that through speaking, advocating, lobbying, but above all, modeling nonviolent living. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresia. Emily, would you like to kick us off or with any questions or comments?
Sure. Well, what's coming to me is, I know this featured in some of the writings of you, John, that I've heard echoed by Teresia, especially in that beautiful quote by your mother on sharing. But I'm just curious about, both of you have really expressed an internal conversion of heart as a necessary precursor to that outward orientation of disarming the world. John, in your writings, you've described this as building up a life of peace, of becoming the practitioners of that creative nonviolence that Jesus modeled for us. So I suspect I know the answer to this, but I'm just curious to hear from you both. Why is that inner journey to transform the heart, either a precursor, or it must happen in tandem with going out into the world and proclaiming a gospel of peace?
Shall I jump in? Well, thank you, Emily, and thanks so much, Sister Teresia, for your beautiful reflections. Actually, I don't believe that, Emily. And sister, I disagree slightly. Now, this is a technical point, and I thought I was trying to be clear about it with this thing about nonviolent life. But let me tell you a quick story why. The very first speech I ever gave in a packed church in 1985 in Connecticut, I never forgot. This person stood up and after my talk like this said, well, this is fabulous, but I'm just going to work on my inner peace. And once I'm now reached perfect inner peace, then I'll join you, John, in your campaign for a more peaceful world. And I balked at that. That is not what Jesus says. You know, we're not waiting to be perfectly peaceful. We're on a spiritual journey, a progressive journey to peace. So that's why I say it's actually three simultaneous attributes. You have to do all three at the same time. I think you could say that the gospel or the Bible calls us to an inner journey and a public journey. And I heard sisters saying that too. I was put it in three. One, working on nonviolence toward yourself, especially because in the United States, everybody hates themselves. There's very little love now, and no one's talking about that. That's what happens to the rich. That you lose your heart and your soul. But at the same time, then you work on total nonviolence toward everybody in the world. But at the third time, you have to have one foot in the movement so that we're not like that person in my talk. Yeah, you're doing your little bit. Every one of us is needed. Everyone can make a difference. Everyone can be Rosa Parks. We don't know who will be that person's spark, that shift that sister was talking about. So it's really kind of a tightrope walk, or, like walking on water. You're working inside, you're working with your spouse and your nonviolence to your kids, your nonviolence at work, your nonviolence to everybody in the church. That's going to be real rough. And you're nonviolent to everybody in the world, and you're nonviolent to all the creatures, and nonviolent to Mother Earth. And you're trying to make a difference by going to protests, organizing, getting out there, actually on the streets like Jesus. Those are some thoughts. Teresia?
Yeah, John, I agree. I agree. And for me, I would see it that one cannot give what you don't have. Like, we have to acknowledge that we are human and we can fall. However, the one thing is to fall and remain there. We need to do something. And that's why I was insisting on a paradigm shift. The way we think, the way we see things, we have to make a deliberate choice to change. And that sometimes it's as John is pointing out, it's a journey, and it's a long journey. But we have to be willing to do that, to take that journey step by step and bring others with us. As I shared there about my parents, I would not have learned how to share or how to be harmonious or how to care, but somebody helped me see that. So there is that journey where, as you grow, you begin to choose, to make choices, you know. And I think if you go to there is where we are told you choose. You can choose life or you can choose death. So that invitation is both. It's as an individual, and it's also an invitation when we join communities. If, for example, we are Christian community, it's also an invitation. Because if I proclaim I'm a Christian, then there are certain tenets that define who a Christian is. So for me, it's a personal journey where I make my individual choice, but also communally, there is that also choice that a community makes. And therefore, it calls on shifting. And I would like to talk for the earth, the environment, because for me, that's where it shows itself very well. For instance, people have destroyed the environment, and the environment is hitting back at us. So we make a choice of destroying it, then eventually we will suffer from it. So the call that Jesus is inviting us to is not only a communal call, it's actually also as individuals to make a choice. He made his own choice to love until death, and he's also inviting us to do the same.
I think that what's really interesting about this, and it gets at your initial question, Emily, but also I think touches on your point, Teresia, where there's this beautiful kind of dialogue that happens between you know, the kinds of teachings that the things that we start to do because we're simply being obedient. We're asking, someone has asked us or commanded us, especially in the case of Christ, right? Who said, just feed them. As he said, like, feed these people, go out and find a way, go out and be peacemakers in the world. And the disciples, I doubt, had already had a change of heart, right? They saw what he was doing and they said, you know, I trust this guy, I'm going to give it a shot. I'll go out and do it. And then in the act of doing it, they start to discover in themselves, you know, I think, John, you've reflected before on I think you called them the Galilee 72, the 72 disciples that Jesus sends out, and they come back and they're rejoicing, and Jesus rejoices because they realize what they've found, the value that they found in that. So it kind of reminds me of philosopher Pierre Hadot. He's a historian of ideas. He has this idea of that philosophy, ancient philosophy, was a way of life, and the way that you actually kind of stepped into these ways of life was by doing spiritual exercises. You might not have actually felt or kind of already embodied these values and these ways of living in the world, but simply by doing them in order to emulate them, it started to become part of who you were. And so to your point, John, I think there's this really interesting kind of like, you know, they do happen at the same time. They all have to happen at the same time, but that doesn't mean that we can't take them one step at a time and just keep taking those steps in series to build, you know, that new life of virtue, that new character of being, in this case, I guess, a peacemaker. I have a quick question around that's somewhat seasonal. You know, Advent is on the horizon, but in the global north, yesterday marked the beginning of the Christmas season, the shopping season, right? And in Toronto and some of the places where people might be joining us, it's kind of the air we breathe right now. I wonder if, especially in talking about the good of the world and of the planet, I'll just ask it this way: are Christians asked to kind of not cooperate, to a sort of non-cooperation in this culture? And what would that look like? What would non-cooperation in the kind of capitalist or consumerist, rather, Christian Christmas season do? What would that?
Yes, I want to respond because I'm coming from a place where that it's only a privilege of the few during Christmas. And so I would have no problem with people celebrating Christmas, but I would have a problem with the issue of consumerism, that you have a section of the world that is luxury, and also even I wouldn't call it luxury, but a section of the world where people are dying because they can't afford food or basic necessities like water. And even in these places you are talking about, Gregory, even in Canada, I'm sure there are people who cannot afford a meal or even the basic necessities. And so that would be my question. So what I would feel they'll be invited to do is to reflect on that. What does that mean for you, you know, as a person who is going, maybe even being wasteful when there is someone else, a neighbor? So it's the whole issue of who is my neighbor? Let me put it that way. The Good Samaritan, the question of the Good Samaritan. So that's where I would see the delink, you know, that are people reflecting and looking at the world as one family, so that what happens like now in Israel and Palestine concerns me. What happens in that part of Africa, for instance, where a child is dying because of lack of food, concerns me. So that is, for me, is the invitation. Who is my enemy in this sense? Who is my neighbor?
Oh, that's so lovely. Thank you. For speaking then as a North American, so I would say, as a North American Christian, I would say to all North Americans and Europeans, we are in total non-cooperation with the culture. That consumerism is violence and is intimately connected to the killing of children around the world and nuclear weapons and the destruction of the earth. My friends and I would have nothing to do with shopping the day after Thanksgiving or at Christmas. And if you want to do anything, give money to Pax Christi International, the sister, and all the other good causes working to change the world. And give your money away. We're on a trajectory of downward mobility. And if you really want to talk about Christmas, we're talking about the coming of God into the world of total poverty that Sister's talking about. And what's the message? The angels can't contain themselves because, oh my God, peace is coming on earth in the nonviolent Jesus. We don't want that simple lifestyle. We don't want peace. We don't want Christ. And we quickly showed him the door, and we much prefer war on earth. We don't want his nonviolence. We don't want the message of the angels. So we're in real bad shape. Now, I invite all of us in the holy season of Advent then to think of it as a season of preparation for peace and nonviolence. And if you want to, just a minute, go into the story. My question was always, where did Jesus learn all this? And the Gospel of Luke clearly says he learns nonviolence from his mother. And I wrote a little book on this because Luke is a genius. He describes, and I'll say this briefly, the life journey of nonviolence in the three movements, spiritual movements of Mary. The Annunciation as contemplative nonviolence, the Visitation as active nonviolence, and the Magnificat as prophetic nonviolence. And you see there the life of Jesus and what we're all called to. Number one, we're contemplatives who are waiting for God to respond, to touch us. And you, like the key for Mary is not the angel coming or the birth. I mean, yeah, but she says, your will be done, whatever you want. I'm the servant of the God of peace. That's our attitude. Secondly, once you encounter God, you get moving. You get out in the world. It's active nonviolence for love of neighbor, which is usually a poor woman with children, as Sister has been telling us. So she visits her cousin. That's active nonviolence. Once you reach out and serve and love your neighbor, like Mary, you move into prophetic nonviolence, which none of us want to do, the Magnificat. God is active in the world, bringing justice for the poor, throwing the rich and the rulers down off their thrones, lifting up the poor. I mean, she's pretty radical. And going to be faithful to the promise of mercy, unconditional love, and total nonviolence. That's the journey of Christmas. So forget money and possessions and get with the program. Get ready for Jesus. Be contemplatives of nonviolence.
Greg, did you want to transition to, we have some questions coming in through the chat. They invite us to shift gears a little bit, unless there's any final remarks on that final question. But we'll head into the chat now.
And do continue to send in your questions if you have them from anyone who's watching. Emily, would you like to read the first one that we have?
Sure. So the assertion that Jesus's last word to the church is "put down the sword" is profound. How do you reconcile the history of the church, certainly that empires were built involving violence and war, alongside the central teaching of Jesus' nonviolent way, his message of nonviolence?
I don't reconcile them. They don't work, and the whole church has to change. And Sister and I have been in Rome, and really Pope Francis is really responding to this message, and he wrote the World Day of Peace message on nonviolence, in large part of Sister's work and mine. Very hopeful, but all of that has to go. But we know, and I said there that the depth, and no one likes this, but for me, the church is the community of the followers of the nonviolent Jesus. If Jesus is totally nonviolent, all his followers have to be totally nonviolent. His community has to be totally nonviolent. The church has to be totally nonviolent. But we know the church throughout the nonviolence of Jesus in the year 315 up till now. So in a nutshell, what I was trying to say was, there in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus says to Peter, "Put down your sword," and it's John's gospel said it's Peter himself who goes to kill, to defend Jesus with violence. Peter's thinking, if there's ever a just war, if violence is ever divinely sanctioned, it's here in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he's right. He should have gone to kill those soldiers to protect our guy. The Holy One's in danger. We got to kill everybody. Put down the sword. Those are the last words of Jesus to the church, to the men and women around him. It's the last thing he said, according to the four Gospels. And Mark is adamant. They all left him, men and women. No one stayed with them, including the women. Everybody ran. And because they're going, oh my God, this guy's nuts about this nonviolence. We don't get to defend ourselves with violence. We have to defend ourselves with nonviolence, and they may come and get us eventually, like Gandhi and Dr. King. So for the first 3 centuries, we now know historically the early church, which was by and large run by women, was a community of total nonviolence. And the minute you got baptized, you did it when you're older, you were pretty much going to get beheaded that afternoon because you're saying, our guy's God, not Caesar. And we can't fight in your army because we're nonviolent people. And then Constantine in 315, in a nutshell, theoretically converts to Christianity, blah, blah, blah. He didn't, in my opinion. And because what did he do? He said, okay, now you don't need to be nonviolent anymore. He threw out the Sermon on the Mount. He turned to the pagan Cicero and came up with the beginning of the just war theory. And we've had this lie. Jesus never said, love your enemies, but if they're really bad and you follow these 7 conditions, kill them all. No, it's love everybody. There's no exceptions. St. Augustine, by the 4th century in the Confessions says, or the City of God, he says, the best way to love your enemies is to kill them. That's insanity. And now this insanity of global violence led by Christians who led crusades, Catholic men burning women at the stake, slaves, the whole insanity, nuclear weapons now, has brought us to the brink of destruction. And so we are being forced, as sisters telling us, to be the first people to wake up to the wisdom of nonviolence, to choose life over death. So we don't reconcile this history of the church. We repent of it. And you and I have to do our part to reclaim the nonviolence of Jesus and to help become the church to be nonviolent. A lot of that work in the United States has meant for me talking to priests and bishops and ministers. Most of the bishops in the United States are all for war. The Bishops' Conference in the United States was founded to support World War I. It's the leading force of Trump and the support for war in the US. I mean, the churches are blessing war. I could go on and on about that. I'm trying to call everybody to repent. You see Oscar Romero doing that. This is what we have to do. Say, folks, it's not Jesus. Something, but it's not the nonviolent Jesus. The time is we have to be the people to love our enemies and become peacemakers. I'm sorry I got carried away. Sister, explain all this to them.
I just would like to support what John is saying, because, I mean, the just war theory has no space and it has no place. And also to say that we also need to challenge all other forms of violence in the church itself. And I think John has pointed out that. And the greatest violence for me in the church right now sometimes is silence. You know, keeping quiet when there, you know, when people are suffering, keeping quiet when there are violent structures and cultures that the church needs to address. And the church has permanence. People believe in the church. So we need to take that space and challenge those structures that, or especially structures of exclusion in the church. And I'm hoping after the synodality, the sharing there, that things are going to change. That and the violence against women, especially in the church, that exclusion of women in the church to be at the table. Yeah, so that also has to be addressed. So we may be talking about wars, but what are those other wars that we are not kind of addressing and challenging? The issue of option for the poor that John has just pointed out there when he was explaining about Christmas. That option for the poor, that embracing the poor, being the good Samaritan. And the Pope, and I think that's why the message of the Pope is ruffling some feathers in some places, because he is actually challenging us to move away from our comfort zone. And as Catholics, we usually say the act of contrition, we usually say, for what I've done and what I have failed to do, what I have failed to do. So for me, that's where the catch is, that we have kept silence when we should be speaking. So that is, sometimes that is very subtle, that we don't see that form of violence.
Thank you, Teresia. We have another question from the chat. Jean-Francois Lyotard said that postmodernism began in the ovens of Auschwitz. The questioner says that their sense is that the real post-Christian era began then as well. Does our being in a post-Christian time allow us to recover the nonviolence of Jesus? Is this not then a moment of hopeful renewal if we take it?
Well, I'm not John. I'm not sure about defining when, because you know, I've unfortunately studied the history of violence in the church, and the monasteries in Ireland that we all love to read about in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, they all had armies. That's insanity. St. Francis is dealing with bishops leading crusades to go kill thousands of Muslims. I mean, the bishops and the cardinals were trying to outdo one another in the killing. Oh my gosh, the abolitionists are working to end slavery, which Franciscans and Jesuits owned human beings, enslaved human beings right up in the United States up to the day of the Civil War. This is insanity. So none of this is Christian. I think you could really argue 315 was a turning point when Constantine legalized Christianity. Remember, Christianity was an illegal religion, and that's because of nonviolence. That's really the rub. And part of what he did, sister, I think you know this, was he said, hey, by the way, you need to stop being small communities run by women. You should become little empires like me. And he created the bishops when he set up the just war theory. So anyway, it doesn't really matter. We are all called to follow the nonviolent Jesus, to put down the sword, and we've got to figure out how to do that. And to me, that means turning in prayer and repenting of our own experience in violence and our participating in the culture of violence and our silence. And second of all, you need to get with a group and like Pax Christi International, which Sister is the global head of, and or a small base community or a peace and justice group in Toronto, wherever you are, or start one so that you can start studying these issues. And what are you going to do? The third thing is you have to do something. My friend Cesar Chavez said public action. Everybody has to engage in public action for justice, disarmament, and creation, whether it's working for the homeless, to house the homeless, or end hunger, or call for an end to the Israel war on Palestine and so forth, and nuclear weapons, climate change. Do something so that you're part of it. But it is hopeful if you look at it that way, because we're being forced to return to the nonviolence of Jesus for the first time in history. Martin Luther King said this over and over again. We are going to have to be the first people in history to lead humanity. Martin Luther King said this the night before he was killed, to lead humanity back from the brink, from self-destruction, and to follow and choose the nonviolence of Jesus, and to create what Pope Francis is now calling new culture of nonviolence. But friends, I find this very exciting. You don't hear me really talking about and promoting the church. I'm promoting nonviolence and the nonviolence of Jesus, because I figure that I see that working with young people and giving people hope everywhere, and the bottom-up grassroots movements to save the planet. And in the process, we become church, we become better Christians, things like that.
For me, I would say that what we are seeing in our world today, it cannot be sustained. It's unsustainable. And there has to be that shift. So I would say we need to move forward, because what we are seeing is not a world that we would like to support. So we need to shift and start asking ourselves, when you look at what I had said earlier, our broken world, so full of violence, killings, and, sometimes it's like unfeeling, a world that's unfeeling. We cannot sustain it. So we have to move from that type of world. So I would see us now moving on a different direction. And I think at the moment, the Pope we have is pushing us towards that. That even if you look at the issue of weapons and spending so much money on weapons, he's saying, look, can we put that money towards what matters? Healthcare, education, you know, so taking care of the environment so that it can take care of us. So I think for me, I want us to have that shift to start looking at a different type of world, and it's not the one we have now.
That's a good segue into one of the questions that appeared about hopefulness. And actually, Sister Teresia, you spoke of signs of life and hope in the church and in the world in your presentation. And the questioner asks, how do these signs, or what other signs, empower or embolden you to be practitioners of creative nonviolence like Jesus? Is there a piece of scripture that especially grounds you in this inner and public journey towards peace and nonviolence?
Yes, for me, John 10:10, that Jesus came that we may have life and have it abundantly. And so it summarizes everything, that everybody, life is about hope, it's about joy, it's about all good things. So I think for me, that is core to what I do every day. And that's why I'm so passionate about nonviolence, because it kind of gives people opportunity to be who they are and who God wants them to be. Yeah, it creates that environment because you are not being judgmental. You know, your enemy becomes your friend. You kind of shift from this otherness, that you don't look at the other as an enemy, but you look at that other person as a friend. What they have can complement what I don't have. So that passage for me is very important.
That's lovely. Thank you. I've always struggled with hope, and my teacher, Daniel Berrigan, said, if you want to be hopeful, you have to do hopeful things. Well, that was helpful. And then about 10 years ago, I'm a real student of Gandhi and Dr. King. I found out Dr. King never talked about hope. I think that's because everything he did worked. You know, he was just like, it was just the finger of God was upon him until the end. He started speaking against the Vietnam War. And everybody turned against him, just like Jesus. And the last week of his life in Memphis, he started to talk about hope for the first time. And then one night there in Memphis, he gave his definition of hope, which to me is very profound and shocking and classic. Hope is the final refusal to give up. That's Martin Luther King's definition of hope. Isn't that great and weird? I'm not giving up. We're going to keep going. That's what hope is about. And I like that. Now, sister, it was so neat that you talked about the feeding of the loaves and fishes, because Jesus says, you feed them yourselves. Jesus is always empowering people. And that's partly what we have to do, empower one another. And the culture of violence and injustice and war says there's nothing you can do, folks. You are powerless. So you might as well just go home and buy some nice presents and things and watch TV, because you can't make a difference. There's nothing you can do. Baloney. That is the culture of war. That's exactly what they want us to do. Jesus is not like that. And so I like the Beatitudes. And when I was writing my book on the Beatitudes, I came across the Aramaic, which is the language Jesus spoke, the Aramaic translation of the Beatitudes. It's shocking and so classic Jesus. It's not, definitely not, happy are the peacemakers, aren't they happy? That doesn't work for me. And it's really not blessed are, because there's a little bit of a passivity there, as Jesus is patting us on the head, goes, oh, you're so nice. You're blessed. That's not what it means in the Aramaic. And I get chills thinking about this. And that's why I started the Beatitudes Center for the Nonviolent Jesus. And you can listen to my free podcast there on the Beatitudes and Nonviolence and Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount. It has resurrection, walking, and discipleship in it. So Jesus is there with these oppressed people, and he's saying, blessed are the poor, the mourning, the meek, the gentle, the nonviolent, those who hunger and thirst for justice, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, and the persecuted. In a nutshell, he's saying, arise, get moving, start walking, and walk forth. And this great French scholar says, if you need it in a nutshell, the actual translation of the Beatitudes should be, arise and walk forth. Isn't that fantastic? So he's saying, arise and walk forth. He's empowering you, poor and mourning and nonviolent and hungry and thirst for justice. Get moving. Arise and walk forth, you who are merciful and pure in heart. Arise and walk forth, you peacemakers, into the culture of violence and war. You are going to get persecuted. The kingdom of God is yours. Arise, resurrection. Walk, discipleship. You're following me. And walk into God's reign. That's the empowering, nonviolent Jesus who gives me hope and all of us hope. And I want it. And I say, let's take it and go for it and do things that no one thinks we can do, because God has called us to great things. Right, sister? Let's go for it.
That is
I've
like,
had too much coffee. Sorry about that.
No,
Greg.
it's-
It's morning.
Yeah.
I'm getting the caffeine through the webinar. It's wonderful. Maybe one last question from the chat, and another kind of seasonal one. And this is to both of you. The church does have a lot of like martial imagery. Christ the King, Saint Michael the Archangel. How do you think about that imagery? Can we reclaim it in kind of a language or a symbolism of nonviolence? Or are the images themselves problematic for the work of peace?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, because in my preparation for confirmation a couple decades ago, I was told to go out and be a soldier for Christ in the world. And that definitely that warlike imagery never resonated with me.
I think for me, it's an invitation, because I also have, when I read the Psalms, for instance, there's a lot of sometimes violent words. And as you are saying there, Emily, about like the king, the queen. So I think it's an invitation for the church. And because language evolves, life evolves. And as we said, like what I was sharing there, that we need to, if we are going to talk, is our reality and address that. So the church is invited, on a journey. So it shouldn't be static. So I believe even the language can change. And I know when I was a teacher, there's a time I was teaching primary school children. I remember I used to take the gospel and write it again in a way that the children would understand. So I think the church needs to be open to new ways of doing things. And now we have the technology, and I can see the church is making some efforts. However, there is always that invitation, because these days, when you go to churches, you notice that they are able to use technology for people to follow what's going on. So I believe the church needs not to be static, that it can learn, it can listen to the Spirit, because the Spirit is speaking. And the synodality that has just finished now, the synod, I hope that what was being said there, what was being shared, that it was looking at the world we are in today, and where are we being invited? Because we can no longer say that this is what the church has said and it remains like that. So I believe the Spirit is moving in the church, and if we are listening to the Spirit, I'm sure it's asking us to look at some of those ideas that are, some of them are violent, as I pointed out earlier, and that may need to be, for people to come together and discuss at the same table. Yeah.
Amen. I agree. And so I would say with Sister, every violent, warlike, military, patriarchal image in the church has got to go. I mean, the whole point of the vision of universal love, we're talking about universal love, universal compassion, universal peace, and total nonviolence. The foundation in the gospel is that every human being is your sister and brother. Actually, we're all one with the creatures in Mother Earth, too. We're all one. We're already children of God. So the images of the church need to reflect that, but the whole cultures, everything's got to go. So what we're talking about, I think, Emily, the way I look at this is we have to reimagine everything. And to put it another way, that, well, how do you define violence? Violence is forgetting who you are. Nonviolence is remembering who you are. You are the beloved child of God. You are a beloved daughter, beloved son of God. Remembering that every human being is your beloved son or daughter of God. Therefore, remembering that everyone is your sister and brother. The minute you forget that, they're not your sisters and brothers, and you can kill them. So now, thousands of years later, we're on the verge of destroying the whole planet, immense suffering. We are all forgetting one of the great casualties that we are witnessing in this culture of total violence is the loss of the imagination. We can no longer even imagine that we are sisters and brothers of one another, much less imagine a new world of nonviolence, imagine a world of peace, imagine a new church of nonviolence where all the images are equality, dignity, justice, human unity, oneness with creation. So part of our work, and the only way to do that is you have to practice nonviolence, and then you can begin to imagine a new world of nonviolence. We're talking about reclaiming the imagination for peace. And it's really about vision, seeing. We can't see a new world without war or poverty. Can you imagine a world without nuclear weapons? Well, we better start trying to. And that's what we have to imagine it, reclaim it, and work for it, point toward it, and help make the impossible probable and then actual. That's what Jesus did, because he's the only one who could see. And all he did was talk morning, noon, and night about the coming of God's reign. There's a new world coming, folks, where everyone practices universal love and total nonviolence. A world without war, racism, poverty, sexism, executions, torture, nuclear weapons, environmental destruction. A whole new world. And it's here and now, as close as your hand. And it's within you, and it's among us. So part of our job is to be visionaries of peace and nonviolence. The church should model this new world and this reign of God that we are proclaiming and seeking. And no one else is going to do this. Nobody is going to come and help us. Pope Francis doesn't know this. This is why Sister and I went there and began actually teaching the language of nonviolence to the Vatican. And it's kind of shocking to us that it's kind of working. So we all have to do that. We all have to be empowered and go in our local communities and be visionaries of nonviolence to reclaim what the world could look like, reimagine our own hearts and lives as people of nonviolence. Have nothing to do with money, greed, violence, war. We never send our kids off to the military. We get rid of all of our guns. We non-cooperate with anything to do with violence. And we help each other rediscover what it means to be a human being, which means to be a person of love and peace and nonviolence. a son or daughter of the God of peace and love and nonviolence. That's our hope and prayer for everybody listening in the world. Thanks for having me, Greg and Emily and Teresia.
Thank you too.
That overhaul is so radical, but like Greg said from the very beginning, it is refreshing, equal parts refreshing and challenging. But I like the gateway for me is the visionary component, the prophetic authority of this nonviolent work. Just the paradigm shift, as Teresia was saying. Like you just have to start seeing the world differently, because no one else will do it for you. So we are involved in this work, and that's why I find this ultimately very hopeful. A refusal to give up, but to continue this work. So we are bumping up to the end time here. So what do you think, Greg? I don't know if we have any time left to get into.
I think if you'd like to wrap it up, that makes sense to me.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you. You've both thanked us for the invitation, but the joy is all ours. Thank you for the graciousness and the authority with which you've shared your true expertise, but also love of the church and of God. So thank you. I've learned a great deal from you. I'll take away a lot to reflect upon. So this is only the beginning. But thank you so much for your time today. This recording will be shared with One Accord platform. And I know Michael will also be featuring some websites for our guests to explore for further learning. So it's a great starting point for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily and Gregory.
Our pleasure. Is lovely to speak with you.
Yes.
Thank you both, and thank you, sister, for being with us. And God bless everybody.
Thank you, John, too, for being there and for your passion. Let's continue the journey.
Absolutely.
Love that.
Arise and walk.
Yes.
Let's do
Yeah.
Yes.
Get moving.
that movement.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you all, and thanks to all of our guests for joining us today as well.